All right, everybody can see that?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so my presentation is entitled Mind Your Business, Reimagining Business, Art, and Science. So this is just a brief abstract. So I want to offer a vision of economy and society that's rooted in creation as opposed to experience and, creation as opposed to production and experience as opposed to consumption. But in order to fully flesh out this vision, we're going to need a couple of tools. So the first tool is a new vision of value, and the second tool is a new vision of communication. And then these two tools combined are going to open up a vision of society where mind and its powers of creation and its joys of experience is the cornerstone, generalizing business to something that I call the commerce of experience. So just a really quick caveat. I really wish I had an hour to present, but given the 30 minutes, I'm just going to be able to give a really broad strokes overview. In around 2 to 3 months, I will be publishing a corresponding paper, and I'll be posting that on my academia edu if anybody's interested. So I'm going to set the tone with a couple of quotes. So this one, the source is unknown, but I think it's pretty inspiring. It says, "When the veil is lifted which hangs so heavily over your eyes and your senses, and you behold the world with the eyes that are unveiled, you will find that it is literally bursting with the most extravagant excitement, passion, and joy. The inner workings of your mind are exteriorized. Imagination becomes palpable. What would you do if you could create a shape, a picture, or a story so that others could see it? Would you like for fun?" And this is from our George Spencer Brown, and his Only Two Can Play This Game. He says, "Our tribal structure, our family nexus takes us to hell and keeps us there by the simple expedient of rewarding pain and punishing pleasure. Every time the child hurts itself, it is comforted, fed, cuddled, rewarded in countless ways. If it does not hurt itself, it is ignored. If it pleases itself, it is punished. After 20 or so years of such conditioning, overlaid and reinforced by a continuous sanctimonious hypnotic verbal commentary, it is no wonder at all that the child, now supposedly grown up to independence, and confronted with the choice we all have to make between a pleasant life and a painful one, unerringly chooses the painful one and goes to hell." But thankfully, according to Spencer Brown, there is a way out. So he says that heaven's way of recalling us back to heaven is as simple as our parents, our families, our tribes, our countries, our humanity's way of calling us out of heaven into hell. It reverses the polarity. It rewards pleasure and punishes pain. Try the permutations as you may, there is no other way. Utterly simple, utterly obvious, yet realized so rarely that its realization is generally taken to be a miracle, and the resulting passage through purgatory is called a deliverance through grace. So this is actually what inspired the title. This is the Fugio Cent. So this was actually the U.S.'s first official circulation coin, minted in 1787. And so this has two core topics that I want to touch on today. So there's Fugio, which is Latin for I fly. And on the back, there is We Are One. So that is freedom, the notion of flying above all possible restrictions and restraint, and unity. So when we commonly think of freedom today, we tend to have one of two viewpoints. So there's something that I call freedom from. So this basically says we must struggle, strive, and fight to protect our freedom from those who wish to take it. And there's something I call freedom between, which basically says that we need to sacrifice, or we need each sacrifice some liberties to enjoy collective freedom and avoid conflict. And correspondingly, so there's usually two accompanying visions of unity. So there's this notion that I call unity under. This says that this particular framework / worldview is the worldview, and we shall unify under its ultimate guidance. And there's something I call unity between, which says that there are so many clashing, conflicting frameworks and worldviews that our only hope is just to try to get along with each other. But are these really our only two flavors? Are these two poles, these two approaches to viewing unity and freedom, are these the only options? So there's this option that I call the Caesarian option. It says that this is the truth, and we will build and enforce a new way of doing things in accordance with it. And there's the more cosmopolitan option This says that truth is relative and our only hope is to make our collective zoo that is this world a bit cleaner, a bit safer, and a bit less crazy. But are these really our only two flavors for unity and freedom? So my approach is to say that no, that these two poles of viewing unity and freedom, the Caesarian and the cosmopolitan, these are simply symptomatic of our hyperfixation on isms. So in other words, virtually anytime somebody has a new idea, this basically in order to disseminate it at all, I mean, the way that academia works, you're going to have to essentially brand an ism, package an ism, and then pit this ism against other isms, whether it be through debate, whether it be through collaboration even, but by and large, ideas become isms quite rapidly. And so think about all the different isms there are. There's absolutism, agnosticism, anarchism, atheism, capitalism, communism, feudalism, sexism, ad infinitum. And this obsession with isms is, I wouldn't even say implicitly, but it's coupled with this approach to the world that is highly objective. So I know that objectivism has a technical type of quality to it. I'm not talking about objectivism in the technical sense, but this intuitive supposition that, we live in a city and this city can be plotted out on a rectilinear grid. And we are simply a body moving through an external space, moving through that city, moving through that map of the world. And this is also how we implicitly view our ideologies, view our ideas. These become isms that are then pitted against each other, plotted, compared, contrasted. So this also takes on a sort of objective grid-like view. In terms of the way that we view our lives, or at least the way that the modern economic paradigm tends to consider what human life is, it views us as basically just a body operating under so-called rational self-interest, moving through an external world. But is this really life? So is this objectivized, rectilinear, gridded type approach to viewing things, is that really life? So on the other hand, is this approach to economics, is this externalized, highly plotted and tabulated approach, is this actually akin to life as we experience it on the ground? So I would say that no, I would say that something like this is a lot closer to how we perceive life. So this is an example of, say, like a theoretical physicist. These are certain scenes or progressions, experiences in his life. And in turn, this is certain scenes and progressions in somebody's life. And so is this as well. So in tandem with this, in tandem with our approach to viewing what life is in this objective sense, we also tend to objectivize our thoughts. So in other words, if somebody has a thought, but they can't really externalize it or communicate it in a way that can make transformations or communications through an external space. So in other words, if they have a thought, but they can't write it down, they can't scrawl it on a blackboard, they can't publish it in a book at a library, these are not really considered thoughts in the modern economic paradigm. So, but are these really thoughts? So I would say that aren't these closer to the thoughts? These sort of immersive spaces of phenomenology, are these closer to thoughts? And in the same turn, aren't these and these here? So this brings up something that I call the life comic. So this picture here, this is just a highly abstract example of the stuff that I just showed. So basically when you consider literally anybody's life, so nobody experiences life as a body moving through an external space. People experience life obviously as a collection of their perceptions, their experiences, their creations, their communications. So this is the type of view that I'm proposing for a view of value and a view of society. This more, and I wouldn't even say subjective, because subjective has a certain flavor to it, but this is a different approach than the highly objectivist approach. And so this way of viewing things, this creates something that I call mind space. So mind space is a new approach to communication. It's a new approach to viewing value. It's a new approach to plotting the things of social reality, essentially. So on the one hand, on the top here, we have creation and experience. So those are the generalized perceptions and experiences in the world. But in the modern economic paradigm, we take this whole swath of experience up here in creation and we tend to reduce it into these little sections of experience that we call goods and services. So these little items of experience that are socioculturally conditioned to have value. And so this brings to mind a completely new conception of what goods and services really are. So in the objectivist style view, goods and services are, they have subjective experience abstracted away. The value is determined by the use of the object. These are viewed as inhabiting a rectilinear objective grid. They have the property of so-called scarcity, and they must be duplicated, loaned, or fractured to be shared. But creations and experiences, on the other hand, in terms of the life comic that I showed before, so this brings to mind a different kind of object. So these are composites of subjective experiences and creations. Their value is determined by subjectively reported experiences and fulfillment. And these are viewed as shared across various life comics of subjective experience, creation, and communication. And these are shared by each composite experiencer / creator, and they need not be duplicated, loaned, or fractured to be shared. And so ultimately what this new approach is also rooted in is a Maslow's type hierarchy approach to value. So instead of having value being something that's exogenously determined by movement through an external space, and then the goods and services moving through an external space, you actually determine value, you root it intrinsically in human fulfillment. And so this calls to mind a completely new vision of freedom. So instead of freedom from and freedom between, there's something I call freedom with. This says that freedom is something that is fundamentally shared amongst people creating and experiencing with a common purpose in mind, the mutual fulfillment of human needs. So freedom needs not be forced, enforced, or promoted. And in tandem, this actually leads to basically a interlinking definition of unity and freedom. So the definition of unity is something that I call unify each other. This ends up being the same as the definition of freedom. So this says, again, that unity is something that is fundamentally shared amongst people creating and experiencing with a common purpose in mind, the mutual fulfillment of human needs. So in order to more fully flesh this out, we're going to need to talk about communication and value. So most of the communication that occurs today is something that I call cloud communication. So this basically says that only little sections of one's life comic, so the whole swath of somebody's experience throughout their life, only a small section of those are deemed important. And the swath of one's creations and experiences must be reduced into such little sections. And experiences and creations are abstracted into information, which is a reduction of the life comic. And so I'll explain that name, cloud communication, shortly. But so here's the basic idea again, this vast swath of human experience reduced into information. And this information is little bits of experience. So cloud communication elaborated. So imagine living in the smoggiest, foggiest city imaginable, whether it be modern day Beijing or industrial revolution age London. For simplicity's sake, we can just call it Smogville. In Smogville, you cannot even step outside your front door and walk down the sidewalk without having to extend a hand in front of you to ensure you don't collide with someone or something slicing through the smog. Imagine that for some bizarre, scientifically unexplained reason, Smogville's smog is so thick that you can literally reach out and punch a hole in the great cloud of vapor pollution. So here's a highly stylized image of that. And so this calls to mind something that I call soot form. So if somebody wants to communicate something A hole must be punched through the smog, and the soot from the cloud must be kept. This clump of soot is then shaped into a particular form the citizen's choosing. Well, sort of. Citizens of Smogville have developed a robust catalog of acceptable soot forms to communicate with, and if the citizen wants to ensure that they are understood, they will choose from amongst the accepted soot forms. But here's the drag. The more they want to communicate, the more soot forms they need to assemble. In the evening time, it is common practice for every man, woman, and child to roam about the neighborhood, punching holes through the clouds, collecting what little soot they can. Before bed, around the nightly fire, they dutifully shape their soot forms. But here's the huge catch. After the Great Soot Panic of 1879, citizens of Smogville were banned from collecting soot while communicating. As a result of the Soot Preservation Act of 1884, citizens were allowed to collect their soot in the evening and in pre-approved areas at that. These restrictions spelled complete and utter disaster for any hopes of smooth real-time communication in Smogville. Since nobody could punch holes while communicating throughout the day, real-time communication became a sort of battleship board game style of interaction, where each conversation pair had only their shared soot forms to guide the way. So here's another highly stylized image. And so although this is extreme satire, there is a powerful parallel here actually between this Smogville style communication and the way that we currently communicate. So the clouds of smog and the smoggy landscape, that's symbolic of the various barriers that we experience in communication overall. And then the need for the soot form speakers to ravenously collect the soot from the clouds. That's symbolic of our incessant need to learn and to acquire various bits and pieces of information to communicate our desires. And so that what I call the Soot Preservation Act and the restrictions, those are symbolic of the various personal and societal and social limitations on the accessibility and digestibility of information. And so the lack of ability to punch unlimited holes in the clouds that obscure communication, that is symbolic of our often infuriating failures to communicate effectively. So here is an alternative vision to this smoggy, highly depressing cloud communication style of
I'm just
information exchange. So this is something that I call
5-minute warning. 5-minute warning.
Oh, 5 minute?
Yeah. So we can have Q&A.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. All right. So this is a different vision of communication. So this is so asemic language. That's something that lacks meaning. So this is simply the prefix uni, meaning one, both in the sense of universality and then multiplicity. And then so one meaning. So what this does, this has two things that both natural language and formal language lack. So instead of restricting meaningful patterns of experience to specific socioculturally conditioned patterns, unisemic language allows one to consider every possible experience, creation, and communication in one's life comic. And instead of focusing on representation, unisemic language comprises objects which are quite literally that which they represent. In effect, the boundary between representation and represented fades away. So here's another illustration of that. So one of the coolest opportunities with all this is actually the technologies of VR and AR. So really before VR, before this technology, there was really no way for mass sharing of specific visions, specific images. So obviously you could go to a movie theater and see a picture in front of the screen. You could have a bunch of bodies collected in the same space and looking at something, but you couldn't quite literally duplicate the exact same experience across different people in different places. So, and here's a really brief illustration of the idea that I have in mind. Okay, and so I'm going to hop quickly into some of the economic impacts of this approach of thinking. So this is something that I call the square of value. So this has 4 different components. It has a role, a script, an evaluation, and a label. So this is just a very abstract, broad strokes view of how societies form notions of value and assign value in different places. So examples of roles are professions, levels of status, types of psychologies, and so forth. But for the sake of economics, the most relevant role is one's profession, or one's so-called role as producer or consumer. Scripts, some examples are economically speaking, the most relevant one would probably one's particular business or the place of employment, and then the related social norms. And then evaluations, the most economically relevant one is going to be that of demand. Labels, the most economically relevant is going to be that of currency. So I wish I had more time to get into all of this, but it's basically just a broad strokes view of representing social value. So this calls to mind, this is something that I call Z-value society. So this is essentially every society that exists currently. So they start with a role, they move to a script, and then evaluation, then to a label. And so in a Z-value system, first it's career field and job title, role, and its accompanying context, norms, and demands determine value, which is then circulated in the form of fiat currency. And Z-value systems, people are bound by what I've called cloud communication approach. And let's skip that. And so my alternative vision is something I call S-value society. This reverses the flow. So in an S-value system, human well-being as the ultimate form of value determines specific instances, events, and projects to increase this value, which then recruit for individual talents and callings in alliance with such projects, creating a collaborative set of goals, missions, and adventures. S-value is coupled with a new vision for how humanity can collectively communicate, create, and experience, something I call mind space. How much do I have left? About like 3 minutes?
30 seconds, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to really,
the Q&A.
This is like the second to last one. So
yeah, cool.
S-value envisions a world that operates according to the principle of human fulfillment as universal value. The things of the world, whether they be commodities, public places, or social institutions, are expanded into mind space. Each thing in the world becomes a composite of each person's experience of it. In other words, each object dons 2 interlinked roles, a personal experience within a particular person's mind, and a collective creation and fusion of each personal experience within society at large. Gone are the days where people feel hopelessly detached from their work, forced to wear a smile that they can hardly keep from drooping. S-value sees decision-making as an intrinsically collaborative endeavor in which the things of the world become mind-space creations, where each mind-space creation is a fusion of each person's subjective experience of it. And so this is just an overview of that approach to viewing what life is, what experience is, what goods and services can be. And there we go.
All right, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we have about 3 minutes for the Q&A. And if we have anyone online, yeah, here's Leon.
Jonathan, thank you. 2 questions for you. It's Leon Conrad here for the people online. Number 1, what does this have to do with Spencer Brown's work? You alluded to it at the beginning. You alluded to the smog, potentially, of the programming. How does anything that Spencer Brown provided inform your work or relate to it? And 2, how does specifically story structure and why we tell stories, how we tell stories, tie into what you're trying to do?
Excellent. Yeah. So I really wish I could have gotten further into connections between, at least in my mind, between Spencer Brown's only 2 can play this game and this approach. But what inspired me most about Spencer Brown is his like seamless fusion of mysticism, spirituality, and yet like super applied on the ground, very innovative technical thinking as well. So that's something that you don't really find. So that is basically the approach that inspired me. And of course, that quote. So his vision of, because he really nailed it on that one. It's very rare to see insight like that. So, and then you said story structure. So yeah, so that's one of the things I wanted to get into was the scientific implications of this type of stuff. But I see a fusion between story structure and the progression of. So one of the things I'm working on is a different way of approaching mathematical notation, and so there are. In the VR sense, where you can actually have a 3D visual progression of notation that actually combines story structure and mathematical progression. So that's actually where you see a fusion of those two things. So that can get very interesting.
And we still have, about a minute, but if there are more questions, that would be great. In the meantime, while you ponder your possibility of a 30-second question, I should mention there's a fascinating book From Nation to Emanation by William Irwin Thompson that uses diagrams that look a lot like that about these topics. And
which diagram?
Well, a lot of the ones that resemble
the abstract one,
the cover of the book.
Oh yeah,
like that.
I love the abstract art. That's cool.
And it departs from what William Blake calls a quaternary, fourfold, opposites, distinctions. So it's pretty interesting. And it ends on Yeats, William Butler Yeats, with two gyres, two intersecting triangles, so it's pretty cool. And it's a vision of society, nation, polis,
Very cool. What was that called again?
Yeah, it's I think it's pretty interesting and relevant. So I just
Nation emanation. Very cool. Very cool.
I also felt like Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy was possibly relevant with bubbles and smog and stuff. But anyway, any other questions at this time? Very brief comments or questions. Yeah, here's we have about 15 seconds.
Okay, so this will take 5. Why did you call that video, title that brief animation Singularity Teaser Extended?
Oh, so that was not my video. That was actually somebody's work. The story that I heard about that is that he's a visual artist trying to imagine what it would be like to have a super intelligent machine starting from scratch and like figuring out all the different patterns of the world. So he tried to represent that visually. So that was just a cool little thing that I found that sort of touched on my approach to visualization in terms of creation experience.
And that was Lori Love for those online, unless you prefer a pseudonym since you hack systems. Okay. All right. Any further comments or questions for Jonathan? All right. Well, let's thank Jonathan.